what we value as society, because I think that if that's not the case, and there could be like the potential that the systems start behaving in ways that we don't expect, for example, or ways that could harm people, it could cause distrust. And then I don't think it's a good idea that society in large distrust AI systems.
Hello and welcome. The following is a conversation with Clàudia Figueras, a researcher and doctoral student of ethics of AI at the Department of Computer and System Sciences of Stockholm University. Her work focuses on the study of how AI practitioners interpret and apply ethics in their work practices. I was deeply honored that she agreed to participate in this podcast. I am Avid Fayaz, and this is the AI Pod. I hope that you enjoy the program. Let's start with a relatively big question then. Why is it important to study ethics in AI?
Yeah, this is a very broad question. And of course, you're asking me who I'm doing my PhD on the ethics of AI, so I think I can talk about this topic for hours, but if I have to summarize it, I think that this, in my opinion, is essential to study ethics of AI. And in all stages of development of AI, so even from early design stages throughout, and also like once the AI systems are deployed. And this is because AI systems are already being implemented in the world, and even though they have the capacity to make a lot of benefits, they are also doing some harms, and also like it can potentially even make more harms in society. So it's very important that we actually take that into account even from early stages, because otherwise we see like what is happening. I can tell you, for example, about specific examples. There's like this. There's a very famous study called the Gender Shades by Timnit Gebru and Joe Bulamini, who studied different software that were used for facial recognition. I think it was from Amazon and IBM. And what they found in that study is that there was racial bias, because women of color had much more percentage of error, so they were much more misrecognized than, let's say, for example, white men. So errors like that, they could have a great impact on society, because being misrecognized, for example, in a facial recognition system could mean that, for example, when you are going through airport security, you are misrecognized, you are misidentified as another person, and that could cause you a harm. So this is just a tiny example. I imagine like other systems that may be applied in the public sector, for example. Like that's something I'm very interested in my PhD, because I thought that AI systems that are maybe in the private sector, of course, they can have an impact, but the public sector AI systems, they affect basically all citizens of a country. For example, systems that decide if someone should get social benefits, or systems that decide, for example, if someone is eligible for job unemployment benefits. So imagine that, for example, there would be a bias in that system. It would cause, for example, like a discrimination for a very high percentage of people. So,
but if we go a bit deeper on the current impacts of AI on society, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the very complex AI structures and systems that are coming out these days and are very exciting for people to study, but very simpler stuff. It can be AI algorithms that learn about people. What have been the impacts so far, do you think? And would you consider them to be a net positive or a negative?
The answer is it depends. It depends a lot on the area and the specific system that we are talking about. So, of course, there's a lot of systems that are already being implemented from healthcare. For example, I can think of IBM Watson, for example, or systems that are being used for helping diagnose, for example, different diseases, and also in transportation with self-driving cars, or for example, route optimization, as well as in finance, banking, or as I was mentioning before, in the public sector, right? So there's many AI systems, especially I think systems that help to take decisions are becoming more and more common. And of course, we have a very kind of hot example, which is ChatGPT, right? Which is a system that nowadays is causing a lot of, I would say, maybe concern and as well as maybe discussion, like maybe good discussion too on the topic. So there's a lot of impacts. I would say that some of them are very good, but some of them could also be like quite detrimental. And what worries me the most is that many of these harms tend to affect the most the people who are already in disadvantage in society. So, for example, groups that are already, for example, minorities, groups that are like racialized groups, immigrants, for example. So those groups tend to be the groups that receive the most negative impact. So in a way, it's like we are exacerbating, we are making the current society harms even worse. So therefore, I think that it's very important to try to put these people on the center and try to, when we design or when we develop AI systems, to try to think first about them, because they are the population that are most at risk of receiving these harmful outcomes.
And what are the causes of this disparagement and these differences that are caused in these systems? Why are minorities at such a point that these AI systems can cause more harm to them compared to a general public?
There are many reasons. One of them, which is like the first one that came to mind, for example, is that a lot of it comes from the data. So many of these data sets are biased and they do not represent all society groups, for example. This is also, for example, something else that could be that many of the people that are behind development or making decisions around, for example, which system should be developed or which system should not be developed, may also not represent these groups. So it's also a matter of for example, because I'm more between social science and ethics, what we call like people in power. So those ones tend not to be, of course, the people that are in these minorities. So in a way, it's kind of easy for them maybe to forget that there could be such groups. There's also, for example, like a big problem with currently in AI systems is for example, like how do we interpret ethical guidelines? Because there's a lot already of ethical principles that are on place, like that they are done, for example, by the public sector, by governments, by the European Commission, for example. There's the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI. There's also like many codes of ethics that companies develop, but it's not clear how exactly they are used. There's this very nice review of codes of ethics that is, I forgot now what's the name of I think Anna Jobin is the first author of the paper, and it's published in Nature, I think it's called Machine Intelligence, that they review the most common codes of ethics, for example, of many countries, and what they found also is that these codes of ethics are mostly published by what is called the Global North, so countries that are mostly located so it will be mostly like Western countries and the US, for example. So there's also a bias in that sense that we also like forgot to include basically like almost all the population in the world, which is located in the global south.
But don't you think that there's also this element that certain governments are more concerned with these issues compared to others? And these systems are so disruptive that if one government develops one of them, it can give them an advantage, leading to the ones that are more cautious with these systems to fall slightly behind. So there's also a balancing act that needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about this. And yeah, if I can name countries, I know that there's, for example, a lot of debate, for example, about China, which is a country that perhaps from the Western point of view, many people could argue that it's not democratic, or at least it doesn't follow the same principles of democracy as in Europe. Or at least some, especially European Union countries. And there's a lot of debate if we should let them develop systems that they don't follow maybe the same ethical principles as systems in the EU follow. But I tend to disagree with this view because I think that it's better to act responsibly and to start doing things well from the beginning instead of acting more as a reactive way, instead of waiting for the AI systems to behave in a way that it's not aligned with our principles, and then we have to go and fix them. I think it's better to act more as a way that, by principle and by showing others that actually you can develop very good systems even within being within these ethical limitations.
And you say, when you say we don't have to act in a reactive way, I think mostly about the impacts of social media on society. That's very simple algorithms have had a very deep impact on our behavior, and it was because we weren't thinking of the negative impacts from the beginning, and suddenly realized after a number of years that they were very deeply impacting society with false information. AI has the capability to even boost that even further.
Mm-hmm.
So it is, I think, really important to have that from the beginning and to take that into consideration. But at the very same time, the issue with these bots and false information sources is that they come from countries that are not necessarily just China, but countries that have a tendency to try to disrupt other societies. Mm-hmm. So what measures can be taken, do you think, as an ethical standpoint from the countries that are trying to implement these systems in such a manner that are positive for society, mm-hmm. to prevent those negative effects in their societies?
No, that's a good point, because of course, like, even that maybe you try your best from the beginning, it could still be that these issues happen, and many times it's not like also like developers themselves have maybe that they were conscious of this that they were having, for example, such biases. But of course, like, some things have to be repaired along the way, or as I was mentioning, this reactive way. But there's still like some principles that I believe that should be followed. I would say that, for example, like principles such as justice and fairness, that should be like one of the main things that we should think about. So it's like, to whom are these systems being developed to? Like, who is it going to benefit? Who is it going to be harmed? That should be something that should be very thoroughly designed and think through before, even in the first phases of development. Of course, the systems have to be also very technically robust and to be safe. And for example, that's something that could happen like quite easy, like some cyber attacks, for example, or maybe like data leakage. So it would be essential that we try to actually to make the systems very robust. I know that, for example, I think like it's Facebook and Google that they have something called red teams, right? That they work towards the security of those systems. And I would argue that that's also like very important, that they are like very thoroughly tested, and that should be also like continuously monitored, because of course new threats can come at any point, so they have to be continuously monitored and checked, and that is fulfilled. And then there is like, for example, I'm thinking of the other principles that many guidelines have, like such as transparency, for example. That's something that I know it causes also some controversy, because there's many of these principles I'm outlining, like fairness, justice, technical robustness, all of that. Sometimes they can be a bit in tension. That's something that I've been focusing quite much in my PhD, what I call like ethical tensions or value tensions, which is that perhaps sometimes to be able to apply one principle, you have to maybe let go from another system a bit more. So, for example, there's a tension between being transparent, but at the same time with privacy, right? You want to protect, for example, in the case of healthcare, it's very important to protect patients' privacy, right? At least I know that in Sweden and in probably many EU countries, healthcare data is considered very sensitive data. So it's very important to be very diligent in how to safeguard the data, like to keep it stored in proper places. So privacy is like a fundamental value, but then there is also the issue of transparency. For example, like how do we make these systems in a way like transparent with the people that are creating the systems and the ones that are receiving the effects of that? How do we make it so that they understand that the systems, right, and that there's AI systems in place? What are the systems about? So there should be also like some kind of education also. And that's something I really believe on, that we should really strengthen like to that for everyone to understand what is AI, what are AI systems, what are these different systems, what kind of impacts could they cause, and also what could citizens do. That's also something that I feel like there's currently lacking, right? I think many people, they feel like they are out of control, like they don't really know what systems are there, they don't know what they can do, if they can contest, if they can go against.
And there is this element, especially when it comes to the health sector, because it's perhaps the most intimate part of information, personal information that people have, that AI can in fact improve privacy. But I think because of these misconceptions that exist within society, there is a lack of a bridge of knowledge between the realities of the technology that can be completely automated so as to ensure that no human or no other human goes through your data. But people, on a general basis of studies, number of different studies have shown that have a lack of trust towards it nonetheless. How do you think we should bridge that gap? Is it just through time? Will we adapt to it, or should we have very broader discussions at different levels?
I think that broader discussions are fundamental. So not only, for example, I would say that we should include in the school curriculum, like already from early ages, and try to explain it maybe to kids in a very, very simple language. I would say that, yeah, maybe not like very young kids, but maybe like, for example, like late primary education, for example, that could be something, and even to reinforce it through secondary education. And also, I'm thinking like, for example, I remember like some years ago, and I remember that the Swedish government sent like it was something I call like what to do in case of crisis, for example, and it was to everyone. And I thought like, oh, maybe they could do the same with AI too, for example, like to have like simpler explanations and to make sure that everyone reads it, for example. That could be something that is done, and even like that maybe politicians try to make that more like as a matter of concern, right? And also then maybe also like so not only like in that sense to all citizens, but also, for example, when in the case of public sector AI systems, that we inform the citizens whenever an AI system is causing something to them, is like using, for example, their data, especially when it's like what they'll call like high stakes decisions, so decisions that could have a big impact on someone's life. I think they should be able to tell citizens that they are using those systems so that citizens could themselves get informed about what are the risks with these systems, for example, and what would be the difference that a human decides over me versus an AI, because there could be differences also. So I think giving information to citizens should be like, for me, it's like almost like a fundamental right. Like they should be informed.
But don't you think that's because fundamentally government is known to be, especially democratic governments, have a small, slow process. So they take their time for going through the different arguments. And these systems are very disruptive. They come at a very high and fast pace. And I think there is this sense of erosion that exists right now, that these systems are taking over many different sectors, and many governments have had different types of failures depending on the government in adapting to them, and at the same time, as you mentioned, informing their citizens about their impacts. Now, of course, I think the European Union has relatively been better and front-footed in taking care of this, but generally, do you have any concerns about this fast pace of innovation?
A little bit, yeah. I think it. Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think that it should be really aligned with what we value as society, because I think that if that's not the case, and there could be like the potential that the systems start behaving in ways that we don't expect, for example, or ways that could harm people, it could cause distrust. And then I don't think it's a good idea that society in large distrust AI systems, because it would be basically like, it would be a shame, because it would make it that people would not use them. and there would be even like ways for them to maybe try to, I was thinking now, I don't know what's the term, but I remember that there's, for example, some people that tried not to be scanned by facial recognition systems by using, for example, different glasses or, for example, using a mask, for example. I remember that they used that, for example, back in the Hong Kong demonstrations, for example. So I could imagine that could be, for example, like a bit like dystopian future, right? That if people don't trust these systems, they could start getting in the ways that, to fight against them. So I would rather that this doesn't happen, right? So I would say that we should this part of transparency and education. I would say it would be very important for that to avoid that happening.
And now that you mentioned the masks and this slightly dystopian future, if we have to mention 1984, I think we'll always in these contexts. But do you see any risks of these AI systems helping authoritarian regimes? I think they are helping to different degrees authoritarian regimes, but even more democratic governments to become slightly more authoritarian and start adapting these systems in the government systems.
Definitely. I mean, there's already predictive policing systems, for example, that are used to prevent or to predict if someone will commit a crime, which are systems that have been shown. I think they implemented them both in the US and the Netherlands. I'm not aware of other countries, but I'm sure that they probably are. And I know that these systems are very racially biased, for example. And so, it could turn a government in that sense more authoritarian and more discriminative towards different collectives. And there's also, for example, the case of the use of AI in the military. So, for example, there's these autonomous weapons that could be used, that I know that there's many people that are against them because that could cause a lot of harm. And then of course systems that could potentially be good, they could also be turned into a more as you were saying 1984 dystopian, depending on for which purpose you use them. That's why I really emphasize this idea of keeping our values very clear. And if we want to keep democracy, okay, then we should really strengthen AI systems to be aligned with what we consider to be a democracy.
Now, we've mentioned data bias a number of times. We mentioned Timnit Gebru. And we have to note that the problem with deep learning algorithms and these more complex AI structures is that, as researchers like to call it, they're black boxes, basically. So we create a system of neural networks and we tell them how they should take in a large amount of data, but we don't necessarily have any control over how that how that data is processed. And that has caused biases because of the fact that these corpuses have different historical backgrounds to them. But how can we try to adjust these systems regarding those biases? What measures can be taken?
So I know that there's a lot of focus with interpretability and explainable AI, because of course this issue with black box, which I think is very common specifically in deep neural networks, right? They're the algorithms that are worse in that sense. I know that there's a lot of focus from different conferences. For example, I really follow this conference called FACT, which is Fairness, Accountability and Transparency of Algorithmic Systems, that there's a lot of focus on trying to develop systems that could explain why they reach a certain outcome or a certain explanation. So that could be a way. There's also a lot of people that say that perhaps, especially when we are talking about high stakes decisions, perhaps we should not use systems that are really black box. Because if we cannot really explain why there is that decision, maybe it doesn't mean that maybe the system is not as good as we think. Because it could maybe act in ways that we are unpredictable and maybe harmful. So that's maybe that should be also something to be considered, or perhaps also the usage of different methods, perhaps maybe by developing a system using trying different algorithms and then see which is the one that that shows us that is like the least black box in that sense. I would say that would be something to look for. And in general, for bias, as I mentioned, like the data is very important. And there's also a lot of research that tries to get the affected people part of like the development process. So it's like a way that is called like participatory design or co-design. So it means that, try to expand the idea of who is the people that are actually developing the systems, because the people that are affected could also bring a lot of knowledge about their realities and about their life experience. So trying to bring these people into that basically that they are not only asked, but that they are actually like really part of the team. That would be something that could prevent also from having all these biases, I would say.
Do you think that there is a necessity for minorities to be involved in the creation of these systems for them to be unbiased?
I don't know if it's a necessary requirement, but I would say that it will probably help, because currently there is almost non-existent that this happens. So I would say that at least getting a different perspective would probably be a way to go forward. But as I was mentioning before, that it's not one thing. It's like many things that are causing this bias. I'm also sometimes also like thinking that perhaps maybe the best sometimes could be to not use AI. Also, like maybe not AI is not the solution for all the problems. I think that there's some problems that could need more interpretable or more maybe rule-based algorithms. So perhaps we don't really necessarily need to implement AI in all cases. So that should be like something that we should really think through in the beginning, like why AI is good in this specific context. What are we gaining and what are we missing? Or what are we risking by using AI?
We have been moving towards, I think at the beginning we moved towards these deep learning systems that were completely unsupervised. They just allow the transformer model to go through a very large corpus. But one reason that, for example, ChatGPT has been so positively reviewed so far is because it has had a humongous amount of human supervision of people going through the data, asking it different types of questions, and at any time having any bias, they've pointed that out, and through reinforcement learning, they've tried to readjust these type of biases. So perhaps even in a high stakes situation, if we have a semi-supervised systems that we try to curtail these type of different biases, we could have more impartial systems that are equal for everyone.
I agree. Yeah, there's a lot of, I know there's like many researchers that are really, they are really trying to advocate more for more like a AI as a support rather than replacement. Because especially for high stakes, I would say it's quite important to have some monitoring or some kind of human in the loop, right? To avoid those unpredictable and potential negative outcomes. So there's like more and more like this idea that systems should be interpretable, should be transparent, and that there should be some humans monitoring the process and even not completely automated, but rather semi-automated, as you were saying, or even more as a support for the decisions. And I'm quite strongly, I would say, on for that.
It is something that I think now we can see in the health sector, especially being adapted, because we have different sets of recognition systems used for detecting cancer or different diseases. And they work with an AI, a practitioner works with an AI, and the AI helps the practitioner to recognize perhaps minute things that practitioner fails to detect. So it is a system that is helping people, and this semi-supervised system helps people to take into consideration things that they themselves might not necessarily see. And I think that as we move towards a symbiosis between humans and the use of AI, it's becoming something that as society has to slightly adapt to. Do you think that adaptation is something that's just happens through time, or do we have to have more ethical training to be able to take that into consideration always about these biases, all the people that use these different systems?
I would say that there should be some training. As the same reason as we have, like, for example, training for being able to drive a car, that you have to pass an exam, maybe, and there's some tests. I would say that if your daily life involves like taking decisions on other people, especially if they are high stakes decisions, then I think there should be some training on how these systems are actually being trained on. How can they misfunction, for example, and what can we do to avoid like maybe those negative outcomes. And I was going to say something now, I forgot. That I know that there's, for example, like current studies that are actually measuring where they are actually being trained with judges, because I know that some judges, especially in the US, in the courts, they use some kind of like support systems. They are not taking maybe the final decisions, but they are being support. And then there's like, it's actually currently unknown how exactly they are being used, because one thing is, for example, to get like an advice, but how are they actually taking that advice? Because I think that there's some research that says that people may tend to over trust the AI, especially in situations, for example, perhaps that they are tired, that maybe they could be, imagine, hungry, for example. They could maybe in those vulnerable situations, for example, tend to over-rely on the AI, for example. And that's something I think we should study much more, like when are we really relying on AI or not? Even for these support systems, how much, like for example, if a doctor gets like a potential diagnosis, how much does it trust that one? Especially imagine the case of a junior doctor that doesn't maybe have the life experience. How do they actually really take in that advice into account? That's something that I would say that more studies are needed to really understand what is the, like more or less like the psychological part around that. Like how are we really taking these recommendations into account?
But don't you see the potentials that as these systems become better and better, they could start taking high stakes decisions for themselves as well?
Maybe. I mean, there's a lot of debate, I know, about this, because I also talk with, for example, some of my colleagues, because I work in the Department of Computer Science, and many of my colleagues they love AI and they develop it themselves, and they are really enthusiastic. And I know many of them that they would tell me, "Oh, but what risk are we taking by not using AI? If the AI systems turn out to be better than people, for example." And I don't know. I think, like, at least for me, current systems as we have it right now, I would say that they could be pretty good, but they are not as effective as humans, especially for those high stakes decisions. And also there's a big problem with responsibility. So in the case that these AI systems start to make the final decision, and this decision can hurt someone, or even, like, for example, in the case of self-driving cars, and kill a human, who is responsible for that action? And I would say that if there's a human behind, then it would be a bit easier to make that, because that person would be the responsible to take that. But if it's an AI system, then the question is, like, who is it the responsible? Is it the company developing it, the developers, the CEO, the people that were collecting data, people that were training? It's such a big system. It's like AI systems, what they have in comparison with other technologies is that they are very complex, because there's many layers that are involved, right? And it's very hard to pinpoint, like, who is the one that took that decision that influenced that later thing, right? So I would say that, like, letting AI do the final decision, I would say it would be a bit dangerous, because then when you have to trace back, I mean, I don't know. At least nowadays, I would be a bit skeptical that it would be easy to find that. That's why I'm really advocating for the support, so that there is always a human somehow responsible.
Yeah, I mean, especially when it comes to self-driving cars, there's this element of we are not still necessarily on the so-called level 5 fully self-driving yet, but statistically speaking, the potentials of AI are a traffic system that is much less dangerous compared to a human drivers driving their cars. And yet we are, I think generally speaking, people are more skeptical towards AI and demand this sense of perfection towards it. Even though using AI might improve the system even if it has imperfections. But nonetheless, do you think that, and you mentioned the complexities of that, but even if we move towards more capable AIs, how should we decide who is responsible? That's a very complex question that I'm putting in front of you. I do apologize, but yeah.
That's quite hard. Yeah, I know that I also heard this argument of the self-driving cars, and then, for example, I also wonder what would happen if there's a very unexpected situation. Like, for example, many of these perhaps self-driving cars are trained, imagine, in a place like California, right? Silicon Valley, and that has a specific climate, specific, like the environment looks a specific way, and then imagine taking that system to a place that looks completely different, right? And then it could be that the car doesn't know how to recognize something well because it's not trained in that environment. And then it may, perhaps like act in ways that we don't foresee. And then the question is like, who is responsible for that? And that's why, I would say that we should be very, very careful. And I know that maybe we have different criteria for humans, but I also think that humans, we have, at least nowadays, much, like our intelligence is much more general than AI systems. AI systems have mostly narrow intelligence. They could be very, very good in some domains, but they are also terrible at others. And for example, I know that there's like the case of generalization. I know, for example, that they were comparing how much an AI learns, for example, what is a cat or a dog, for example, by images, and then they were comparing with kids. And for example, like human kids, like they can really learn very fast to recognize, for example, between one thing or another, whereas for an AI, it took a very long time to train it. So in my opinion, is like maybe perhaps we should let humans do things that we are better at as humans, and maybe the AI do things that maybe as humans we have more problems with, such as, for example, repetitive tasks that are very prone to being, for example, boring and prone to error because we get very tired of that. For example, like nowadays there's a lot of use of AI as robots, right? For example, for industries. And I would say that probably quite many people are pretty happy of that because it's a task that is like, it's boring, it's physical, it's very, very demanding for the employee. And then in that case, maybe an AI system could be good, but maybe there's other tasks that I think like humans could necessarily, they are not that bad at. And maybe an AI replacing that, I would say I would be a bit more skeptical. That could be totally like a better gain. Again, I'm more of the AI support rather than AI replacement.
And how much would you say we as programmers should take into consideration about what we are trying to create and the consequences of it? I mean, the reason I asked the question about self-driving cars is that if someone develops an AI that is a self-driving AI, should they take into consideration that I will be responsible, might be held responsible if this car crashes, or are they just developing a software for the car?
For what I know, also is that many times, many developers, perhaps they are not really involved in the whole system. It's like a part of it, right?
Exactly.
And many times also, it's true. It's like, it's hard because they don't really know many times why are they developing this. And I know, for example, there was a case some years ago with Google that many people, they were developing some kind of like facial recognition systems and they didn't know exactly why. And then they turned out to be like systems that they were used, I think, for military drones. And then actually many people decided to quit because they were like, they didn't want to be involved in that. So of course I think like companies should really inform their workers exactly on how the systems that they develop may be used for, especially if there's if it's for a very different usage than the one that they thought in the beginning. I think they maybe would like to be, of course, informed in that. But how much responsibility should we put on developers? I mean, it's hard to say. I would say that, of course, developers have a big impact because they are the ones that have a lot of impact on deciding how the system is going to be developed, how it's going to act later. But also the people, maybe the employers, like the people that actually like maybe have the company should be also the ones that have a big of a say to, and also like carry responsibility in case that there's a system not behaving as expected.
So perhaps just to relieve ourselves from any responsibility, we say the companies.
The companies responsible.
Should be held responsible. But no, I think that it's a very complex question that has so many different ethical aspects to it. And I was discussing the same issue with a number of different developers, and the subject of AIs that can be quite offensive and create offensive music came up. And the response has been mostly that it's just we have to have whole discussions throughout society and try to develop things with considerations towards these debates that are just ongoing in society, because we have to especially in subjective matters such as music or art, it's just simply a matter of the zeitgeists of society to a certain degree at this very same time. But it's very hard for many developers, I think, to navigate through these situations. Now let's mention perhaps the hardest part for many developers. We mentioned autonomous weapons a number of times. And we see now, I think in Ukraine, we can say that it's the first time that we see a full-out use of autonomous weapons from both sides. And for me, it has been interesting because at the beginning of the war, when the Ukrainian side started using the autonomous weapons, the media were relatively positively suited towards it. And afterwards, when Russia started using them, they started realizing what a horrific things autonomous drones can be. What safeguards should we think of when we think of especially autonomous drones and killer drones in terms of wars? There are talks of creating systems that completely ban them or limit their uses.
Yeah, I mean, this is very complex. I don't have like a very good answer. Of course, in my opinion, I think we should not use these systems at all. But of course, I may sound naive too, because then someone could tell me, "Oh, okay, but if then there comes a country with those weapons and start attacking you, then how do you defend yourself?" So I would say that maybe from a defense perspective, perhaps I could justify more that, but I would say that this becomes like an arms race, literally. So it just makes it even more like worse and worse and worse. So yeah, I may sound utopian or idealist, but of course I think in my opinion, this system should be out of the context, because like then it seems like then everything we talk about ethics, it's like it doesn't make any sense right here, because we are really not following any ethical protocols at all, because it's basically the intention of these systems is to create harm, right? And one of the main ethical principles is do no harm. So it becomes a very different ethics, which I'm not that familiar with. I would say, I read a little bit about the AI in use in the military, but it's a little bit out of my domain. So yeah, I don't have maybe like a lot of knowledge to talk about that in depth.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to mention that I think
there is this sense that some people say that it might be naive to think that we should not use them because others might use them against us. But there are those instances and glimpses of hope that humanity says, okay, this is just too dangerous for anyone to use. And in terms of chemical weapons, for example, general conventions have been created to completely ban their uses, and they have been relatively successful. So I think, with consideration to how dangerous these systems can be, there is a possibility that we can create conventions in the long term to stop the use on a general basis of speaking from all sides.
Then I will sign that.
Now, I think we can move away from weapons and more towards the sense of believing that AIs have come to life to a certain degree. We humans have a very high tendency for anthropomorphization. There was this Google developer that was of the very sincere belief that the Lambda system had become sentient. And as we move towards more and more systems that are capable of, to a certain degree, even persuading human beings that they are sentient and they're conscious, we are facing a question of, as developers, of course, we are aware that these systems are in no way whatsoever conscious, but how do we communicate that to humans and our over tendency to believe that things that are not necessarily alive are alive?
So I think, in my opinion, science fiction maybe have contributed a lot, right, to this idea that we have like an AI system. Even sometimes I'm even a bit like skeptical of even the term AI, because I know it's used because it's a catchy term, but we don't really have AI right now as we think of general intelligence, right? Like all the AI systems are more like narrow and used in very specific sectors. So of course, like in this sense, like movies like Terminator or like other science fiction books and movies have, in that sense, harmed a lot, I would say, the population perspective, because they have made it very grandiose and very much like making people maybe more scared. Maybe some people also made them more curious, but I would say that when you talk with general population, I would say like it makes them maybe more scared in that sense. And I would say that, that's quite sad, because what we should promote instead is like this education idea on understanding what are the current AI systems that we are doing, what could we have done so far, and as we were mentioning before, like the impacts that are already causing, the effects, what's good, what's bad, what can go wrong, for example, with these systems. I think that, like as you were mentioning, this tendency to anthropomorphize is unfortunately quite common. And I think we are far from that, because, even in, for example, ChatGPT, like we cannot really say that ChatGPT, for example, really understands as a human does. Like it collects very good data and it makes very good sense of this. But the idea of understanding, it's a quite complex cognitive process that I would say that this system is like not really doing that. And there's like quite many examples that you can see that the system is not really understanding in that sense. It has a more like maybe superficial, at least at this stage now. I don't know, I cannot really talk about what will happen in 10, 20 years. I don't really know, but at the current stages now, I would say that we are a bit far away from having conscious systems.
That's I think the part that's so interesting about it is that we are far from having any sort of general intelligence AI. And yet, even from the 60s, the ELIZA system, that was one of the first chatbots in the world, if we call it that, made people believe that it had some sort of a consciousness. So don't you think that there is a slight concern that people start believing these AIs, as you mentioned, many call them parrots, basically, because they make some sort of a mashup of different words that make complete sense, but in reality are not in any way understanding what exactly what they are saying is. They just make words that make sense to us.
Yeah, I think that, for example, through education and critical thinking, that could be at least help to make people more conscious about what those systems are and what can they accomplish, and maybe even the systems themselves, like, yeah, for example, this ChatGPT, like maybe perhaps like show like warning messages.
Yeah, I think ChatGPT is relatively better compared to most systems, chatbots to that. But what we're coming to is basically the education system, and the whole world needs to change and adapt to teaching people more about AI.
I think so. Yeah, because I mean, I would say probably many education systems are still like not really much up to date with current technologies. Like technologies go faster. The same thing with laws, right? Like that technology always goes a bit faster than the law. But with education, I think like it wouldn't be that complicated to already have that from, as I was saying, like from already like maybe late primary school, and to start talking about the systems. I know, for example, there's this course by, I think it's like Helsinki University, called The Elements of AI, which is a course that is designed for the general population to learn about AI. So there's already like some initiatives that are taking place regarding this. The only thing is that I don't know if governments would be up to making this as a more for everyone, but I believe they should have that.
And it's a very interesting thought to think that governments will need to adapt to be able to create citizens that have that way of thinking about AI. But we have to, I think, become human beings on a general basis. Their understanding about technology has to become much more developed for them to be able to adapt to the new societies that we are trying to create. But also, there is this element that governments in developing countries, we see that our lives are heavily impacted by technology, and yet many people in the world, in underdeveloped countries and developing countries, don't have any access to any of these technologies. What measures should be taken by the governments of developed countries, perhaps even companies in developed countries, to help those countries that are developing to be able to catch up and not be left behind?
True, yeah, but this is a bit similar to what I was saying before about the global north and south, right? That you can see that almost all the development takes place in the global north, and then yeah, the global south is left a bit like is quite much left behind, and maybe even there's even some research that says that maybe sometimes even it could be that the global south countries could be used maybe as a way, like as a testing place, but that would be like rather unethical in many aspects. So yeah, I think like that maybe this like perhaps I don't know if it should come from the global north, but already maybe the governments from the global south should start thinking how can they use these systems for a democratic way always, like not to make this like the current authoritarian systems even worse. And maybe even also like same thing, like having it as part of education, and maybe even have initiatives maybe from the global north to promote this education. I would say that rather than bring the systems, it's better to rather help teaching about the systems or helping them develop them, how to use it. I know that there's like this or this saying that says that don't give a man a fish, like teach them how to fish, right? So maybe we should apply the same principle here. Instead of like giving the technology there, like maybe it's better to explain the means on how to obtain it. But of course, this technology is also like very expensive to build. Not only because of the materials that are used, because many of them use like very like rare, for example, minerals, which are expensive, but also the ways to train them. Since you need to train them, many of them, on a lot of data and a lot of quality data. And that requires like a lot of energy and resources. And maybe that could mean that some countries don't have the capacity for that. So it will, in that sense, create more inequalities.
But I think that there is this, and maybe I am slightly too optimistic, but there is this, of course, this very negative side of more authoritarianism and more control over the citizens and incursion upon their privacy. But could the world governments in developing countries, in democracies, try to give this AI capabilities, perhaps many of them are cloud-based, so they give access to them as some sort of aid. So basically they give access to them to developing countries so that they could improve efficiency and fight corruption, and they're very good at and efficient for going through massive amounts of data and help become more efficient in the processes. And we see that, for example, I think the Gates Foundation is working with electrical grids in Africa and improving electrical grids. So we see that there are those glimpses of, if it's specifically directed towards certain sectors, it can truly bring some positive effects.
I think potentially, yeah, but it could potentially also happen that maybe some of the things that we create in the global north are not applicable to global south. I know, for example, there's like a study I read like some years ago from the FACT conference that they discussed the concept of fairness. I think it was in the US versus in India, because they said that this main concept of how to distribute for example, like resources in a country in a fair way, it could take like, it could be debated, like there's no one way to do it. So then I wonder if it could happen also that maybe other systems that are made for a specific context, perhaps it doesn't necessarily translate that well in other contexts. So it depends a lot on which kind of AI system we are talking about. I know, for example, there's like even issues with like, not only with ethical principles, but for example, languages, like maybe a system that, you know, like it's used in one language, maybe you translate it and it's not translatable exactly the same. So it requires some work. It's not impossible, but it definitely requires like, I would say like very much like understanding of the context that we want to implement these AI systems on. It's possible, but yeah, I would say it's not as easy as to say like, okay, I'm just using this system in Sweden, I will use it in Gambia. I think like, yeah, we should really consider the kind of situation that we have there, like political context, historical context, environmental context. Yeah, it's so a bit more complex.
Slightly more home-based situation where it's tailored to each country.
Exactly, yeah. Maybe the fundamentals could be the same, but then it should be more trained or better, like optimize or improve for each specific scenario. Yeah.
We are moving towards a more autonomous world, and again, ChatGPT is a slight glimpse, and GPT-3, OpenAI's GPT-3, which ChatGPT is based on, has also this codex system that is very good at programming. And there's a belief in economics that as productivity increases, so does the demand, and so new jobs are created. But there is this concern that AI might start taking over many jobs that exists, and even if it's not necessarily a general purpose AI that can take over everything that we do, it might take over many low-paying jobs that are simpler. This brings on society the question of what should people do in a society of the future, which might have many fewer jobs for a relatively growing population.
Yeah, no, there is a lot of concern about that. I would say that maybe it has been overall like worse sold than it was actually in reality, because I think that AI could be very good at as I would say, at narrow tasks, at tasks that are repetitive and boring. But there's also some tasks that one can consider that to be, like, for example, let's say like cleaning floors. And actually, maybe there's not that many AIs that are currently doing that. And then, yeah, like maybe that, you know, like I don't think it will be as fast as we think, maybe this replacement, because I think we are starting to realize also that there's more tasks that are harder to automate than we think. But of course, there's a lot of tasks that are already being, like, as I was mentioning before, like robots in industries, for example, right? Or like, I know that there's like these like Amazon warehouses that they're almost like autonomous, right? Or even in the case of transportation, and that can happen. for example. So then it becomes more important that that people are maybe trained on maybe what can they do around this new system. Like, for example, like imagine in the case of transport, what could the people that are maybe taking the job, what could they do? Could they do other tasks that are, for example, maybe more regarding monitoring, or could they go to another sector that maybe they could be more needed? But of course, that usually involves some training and some education, and it will be even more and more that this will be even more needed, I think, with time. So that should come. So that's why I was saying that I think government should really start doing that from a very early age, so that already kids can think about how do I want my future to be, because it can happen that maybe certain jobs that are nowadays possible, maybe it's not possible anymore in the future.
Yeah, I mean, there is this element we see, I think, in the United States now. The reason it has occurred in the United States is because ever since the 1970s, many jobs have moved because of globalization to many other countries. But there is this sense of discontent that a person could finish high school and find a job that would support them throughout their lives, perhaps in the 70s or 80s.
Yeah.
And now they need to go to university. They need to have a higher education and more advanced training.
Yeah.
And there is this discrepancy that is being created between those who pursue higher education and those who enter the job markets at a very earlier age. What do you think should it be just upon the governments to address that, or should there be created other nets to protect these people as well?
Yeah, maybe perhaps the companies that are making all this automation, maybe perhaps they should be the ones maybe that are also thinking about their societal impacts, and then perhaps start thinking how can we make people maybe adapt to this new change. I'm thinking now, for example, I know that there was many years ago, there was the job of, for example, the people that made train tickets, they have to do it manually, or airplane tickets, and then all these jobs were removed because we did it digitally, right? So something like that can happen also now. But in a way, there's also the belief that AI could also create many jobs maybe around that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be concerned about removing jobs, because it can just mean it creates jobs, but in another way that we haven't expected, or in another sector that we don't know. And there's also, I know that there's some discussion on using having universal basic income. I don't know if that's a bit utopian to idea, but there's some people that believe that maybe by the extra gains that the AI can have in making some sectors more productive, we could use those gains as a universal basic income. But I don't know if that's really something that will happen or not, because in my opinion, I think that most of the people that get the benefits, they tend to maybe not spend it in that way. They spend it in other ways, maybe. So I don't know if that's I would argue that it would be potentially pretty good, but I don't know in practice if that's something that's going to happen. Yeah.
Now we begin this conversation with the importance of ethics in AI. Let's discuss the general impacts that you think are going to come for humanity, your concerns about the future of AI and humanity. To finish it, what would you say are the positive long-term effects that you look forward to, and what are the biggest concerns that you have?
I think positive. I think AI has the potential to be to support many human decisions, and I mean, if they can argue for explain why they take that decision, I think it could be very useful, and we are already seeing some benefits. For example, in the medical realm, in education, for example, in helping teachers to, for example, spot which students need to perhaps that they need extra help, if they are directed towards them, for example. Or also, for example, in government, in trying to distribute the resources more equitable through society, or, for example, I don't know, to detect tax fraud. So it could be like, for me, like in supporting decisions, it has like a lot of like potential benefits. But yeah, we should also be careful because it could exacerbate social inequalities that are already existing, and all these problems with bias, racial bias, gender bias, for example. They are like problems that we can see nowadays, and AI systems could even make them worse, I think, since they learn on current systems that are basically very biased by themselves. Then maybe also, well, I don't know, I think we are a bit far from that, but in the case that, for example, like if one day AIs get to be more autonomous, maybe there could be also some concerns on what happens if we cannot really stop them from acting. But I don't know, I'm not so worried about this point for now. I think like it's more for me the problem of exacerbating inequalities that I would be mostly concerned on. I think that's the one I think that, yeah, for me is the most scary at this point.
Just one last question on the question of control, perhaps in the more general AIs. Don't you think, because we discussed that we have to be very concerned from a very early stage in these developments, that these AIs are, the negative effects of them are well thought through? I think that there is a general sense between especially some groups in academia that are very concerned about the general purpose AI suddenly being created, not necessarily even by an absolute intention, but because of a creation of different systems and all of them being put together. What measures do you think that should be taken if a general purpose AI is being created? And what things do we have to take into consideration to remain in control?
Oh, yeah, that's hard. Yeah, it's hard because, as I was saying, like I think we are not that close to that yet, but trying to imagine that it could happen. I think like, I don't know if we could, so you mentioned like it's already created, right? We are not in the process of creating, it's already there.
Let's say we are just like 5 years away from it.
Okay.
So we have a timeline, it is coming, but it's not necessarily there yet, because I think if it is there yet, it's going to be really harder to control.
Yeah,
so
I think so. Yeah.
Let's say it's just we have a slight amount of time, but what measures do you think we should take into consideration, immediate measures to have control over this system?
So, first of all, trying to see that the system is still like behaving within these like ethical principles. I would say that they're keeping deciding which principles we want to enforce, and trying to keep this like to make this like very clear. Also, like in terms of security, I think we should always have like a potential like redress point, like what happens when the system doesn't act as we think. There should always be like some potential route to maybe disconnect the system or to make something that so the system stops acting. And then maybe also deciding when should these systems be implemented or not, and then have really like a very clear plan of action on that. That's why I really emphasize that this should be taken like from very, very early stages, and not to leave that to potentially that it can happen.
Yeah, hopefully AI will be a positive force.
I hope
for
so.
humanity for
a
very long time. But I want to thank you for participating in this
Thank you very
podcast.
much for inviting me. Yeah, this was enjoyable.
Absolutely. So it was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.